Hello there and welcome back to Japan's Perfect Pens for a Namiki Emperor review. Today's Namiki Emperor is the Pilot Namiki Emperor Pavilion by Kyusai Yoshida, translating as the Pagoda in Mountain Scene. Now, this 1998 pen came out just after Pilot had started differentiating their international sales with the Namiki name, so it is interchangeably called Pilot or Namiki, but it says Namiki on the pen and on the nib. This is a rounded cap Namiki Emperor, which means it's an ebonite eyedropper pen with a valve about 17 centimeters long. There's no Maki-e work on the clip, and it has a single tone size 50 18 karat gold nib. The dominant scene is a pagoda or a pavilion with mountain backgrounds and then some trees on the mountains, and it uses Togedashi Take Maki-e, which is burnished raised Maki-e. So unlike more of the more recent emperors, there are only a few points on this pen where they used the raised Maki-e, and most of the pen uses the flat Maki-e, but it does use it exquisitely. Now, if you've already seen my 10 Namiki Emperor reviews, my top 10 list, this came number one. Of all the emperors I've seen, this is my favorite pen. And as I mentioned in that review, it's not the most technically difficult pen, but it is the pen with the scene I like the most. So if we have a look at it, there you can see the pavilion. This is a common orange-red color. They're quite common in Japan. You see a lot of them. You can see the mountains have a line of trees rising up there. You can see the red at the top. You can see the artist's signature here at the bottom. So here is the pavilion. You can see that is where the actual raised Maki-e is. So you can see those golden lines that make it the bricks at the bottom of it. They're raised above the surface, whereas actually the mountain structure isn't raised. So the light in this photograph shows it a little bit better. There's the raised Maki-e. Very interesting, because in a lot of these pens, half of the forms are raised, but here you've got one specific point that's accentuated through that, whereas these beautiful mountains are using flat Maki-e, and it's delivered very well, but it does give you the impression of the foreground where this structure is, and then the background with the mountains, and the layers of gold powder you see there almost as clouds and mists, and it works aesthetically really well. So by not overdoing on the complex techniques, they do a very good job of making this a seamless, beautiful design. Now, next to the pavilion is a cherry tree in full blossom, and then the line of trees at the top are the cherry trees in the distance, and then you can see what are probably small pine trees silhouetted against the pen. So as I rotate it here, you get a good glimpse of the pavilion, and then next to it here is the stylized cherry tree. Now, this style of landscape is very popular in Asia. It's having the different layers rising above each other, but without necessarily having a single perspective that's consistent throughout the pen. So if I open it up here, you can see here is a single tone old style nib. So this is before they brought in the Mount Fuji device which they use, but we'll come back to the nib in just a minute. But what you can see, I think, here is that the rest of the pen is gold, and the nib being gold and not being two-tone actually helps to keep the theme going. I think a silver nib would stand out quite a lot in comparison. So having a look at these mountains, they come in multiple layers. So you have these sort of steep cliffs, one over the top of each other, and then they have these trees on them in the distance, very small profile trees, to give them a little bit of scale. And then a little bit of colour provided in the cap up here by this band of trees there. And you can see even there you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 layers of cliffs with vegetation hanging off them. And this pen is all about serenity, which is a huge theme in Japan. Not always necessarily captured in the Namiki Emperors, because a lot of them are about vibrancy and about life. But this, a pavilion in the mountains with cherry, this is all supposed to be about peace and tranquility. So there's nothing jarring here, there's nothing inconsistent with the rest of the pen. That beautiful cherry tree next to it. So if we just turn the pen around, and there's another tree there at the back, a small tree. Let's take a look at the nib now. So this size 50 Emperor nib is 18 karat gold, and effectively it is like the modern nibs, but the aesthetic is quite different. Now, when it comes to writing with such a large nib, it is a smooth experience and generally has a very wet flow. The valve towards the back of the pen controls whether the ink has access to the section and to the nib. And if you want to see how they write, I have a video called Namiki Emperor Fountain Pen Writing Sample and Review. This is the thumbnail, and in that video I write with 3 size 50 Namikis. So in brief, they're very smooth writers, like I've already said. They're very wet writers, but they are very large nibs. And principally that means that they have quite a bit of bounce, but it also means they're very long, and it means that where your fingers are gripping the section, they're a long way back from the tip of the nib and the paper, and that gives a very different feel to writing with a normal size nib, which is nearly half the length of this pen. So I absolutely love it, but it is something that is great for some people and not great for other people, so I encourage you to check out that video. And it is backed up by having an absolutely massive ink capacity by being an eyedropper pen. You can just see the line of the eyedropper valve there just below the bottom brick of the Pavilion or the Pagoda itself. So I'd like to talk a little bit about how this differs from the modern Namiki Emperors, because this was one of the forerunners. So this pen is now 23 years old, being a 1998 pen, and the style has changed somewhat in the modern pens. So on this pen there is much less raised Maki-e work. I think in a modern pen you'd see at least 2 large clusters of raised Maki-e work. You'd see one on the cap and one on the barrel, but that doesn't suit this scene. This is a mountain scene, and you want the foreground at the front to be closest to the eye, so that's the only place where you have the raised sections, just ever so slightly raised sections only on the Pagoda, and you have the mountains done very gently. Now it is a very difficult art because you see the whole shading of the mountain is done by the gold powder. Now gold powder decoration is a very common thing on Namiki Emperors, you see it on many of them, but this gold powder is absolutely masterfully laid down because it gives you the contours on the cliff face, it gives you the lines around the mountain, and without that being done well, it wouldn't look like mountains. It would look like the shape of mountains that had been coloured in badly, but it gives you a very strong sense of the distance, of the scale, of the pagoda being at the front, the mountains towering up behind them, and also the peacefulness of the scene. They're sitting there in the clouds, they're rising through the clouds. And I think this is, in some respects, it's much less than comes on more modern pens, where I'd expect them to be a little bit busier and have a bit more vibrancy, more focal point. This is much more like a painting on a pen. Now people say that often about all the Namiki Emperors, but for me this really is a painting on a pen, and then whether this pen is great for you comes down to whether or not you like that painting style. So in that capacity, this reminds me of the Namiki Emperor Nightline because it's actually a slightly simpler form, but masterfully well done. And it's the mastery that makes the pen great as opposed to the complexity. Okay, well, there we go. That was a review of my favourite Namiki Emperor. Please like and subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed this, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you, and bye-bye.